Shoutouts this week to a couple of new furry friends we made when we recorded our interview, Fred and Joe. That's short for Joanne. They provided our studio audience for the interview today. Bill Eisler and his wife Marty were close with Fred and Joanne Rogers, so much so that when Bill and Marty decided to name their beloved rescue dogs, they named them in honor of the very people we will talk about in today's episode, Fred and Joe. Now, before we get started, if you've listened to all of our episodes, you may have noticed that in episode 1, I talked about the time I met with Fred Rogers. Today we're going to give you a better sense of who Mr. Rogers really was and the philosophy behind not only what he did, but how he was able to make you feel the way you did while you were watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. If you have any thoughts or feedback, send them to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com. If it's easier for you, get in touch on Twitter or Instagram @shapingopinion. If you want, we can give you a shout out. And as always, thank you for being a listener to the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. In the movie It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, you're portrayed as being very protective of Fred Rogers. Was that an accurate portrayal, Bill?
Very. One of the responsibilities I had was to make sure that Fred was not overwhelmed by people. I mean, when people would see him, they would want autographs, they would want to talk with him, and Fred would want to talk with everybody. Fred would ask questions. I mean, he would ask them about their childhood, about their families, and so people would think, well, I'm just going to be here forever, and you really had to keep people moving and help Fred get through a crowd. So yes, I was protective, and I was very protective of people who would come in to see him, wanting them to understand that he was a human being. He was real. As he would say, what you see is what you get. So yeah, I would say I was protective.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Bill Eisler. He was the longtime president and CEO of the Fred Rogers Company and was a close colleague of the man most people knew as Mr. Rogers. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Bill about that movie you may have seen starring Tom Hanks called It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. But mostly, we'll focus on Fred Rogers, both the man and his legacy. There's a good chance that sometime in the past year you sat down and watched a documentary or a movie about Fred Rogers, the man known to millions as Mr. Rogers. And there's an even better chance that during the course of your life, or if you've raised children, that you've watched Mr. Rogers on your PBS station or on video. Fred Rogers' contributions may have been understated or underappreciated at the time, but by the time Mr. Rogers ceased production, the programs and the man's contributions to television, to education, and to generations of viewers was unchallenged. Because of this, we're not going to attempt to tell the whole story of Fred Rogers in this episode. Today we're going to talk with someone who knew Fred Rogers in a way that few others did. Bill Eisler oversaw operations at Family Communications, Inc., the organization behind the Mr. Rogers program. After Fred Rogers retired from producing new shows, Bill would transition to become the head of the Fred Rogers Company, where he was responsible for carrying on the legacy of Mr. Rogers, bringing those iconic characters to new generations. If you saw the movie It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood starring Tom Hanks, you may remember the performance of Enrico Colantoni. He played Bill Eisler in that movie. With that in mind, I had to start this interview by asking Bill when he first heard about the motion picture, who he thought might have played him in a movie.
Yeah, I never had any idea. When they first of all, I did not want to be my name in the movie, and they asked if they could use 3 people: Joanne Rogers, Fred's wife, Margie Whitmer, who produced The Neighborhood, and me, because of my relationship with Tom Janot. His story was the basis of the movie. And Tom and I had gotten to know each other over the years and we we're good friends. We still talk with each other. So when he was doing the interviews with the screenwriters, he would talk about Bill Eisler, and they finally came to me and said, we really want to include you. I said, no. Then they did. So when I was talking to the director, Mari Heller, she said, I have a really wonderful, edgy person that is going to play you. And I said, what's his name? And she said, Rico Calatoni. And I said, oh, I've always wanted to be an Italian. I grew up in Brookline, and I was always known as the wannabe by my friends. Like Henry DeLuca would always call me the wannabe, that I was never Italian. So when I got to meet Rico, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, we hit it off right away. We became good friends. We still are good friends. I visited him in Los Angeles last year, and he and his wife are coming down to see us in the next month or two. I've seen him off Broadway, going to see him on Broadway. But to get to the specific question, I never really thought of myself of ever being in a movie, and I was pleasantly surprised when Mari picked Rico, because I think he did a really good job. He mimicked me in a good way, and one of my favorite scenes as a movie is when they're leaving Lloyd Vogel's father's house when he was there to visit him when Fred was there to visit him, and Rico and Lloyd exchange, about the story, and Lloyd Vogel says back to my character, Bill, do you like the story? And he just taps his two fingers on the roof of the car. I mean, that's sort of what I did. I mean, I didn't always speak, but would, do things like that. And Rico picked up on that. It was really an amazing process.
There are some other things I want to talk about related to the whole Mr. Rogers program and the movie, but let's talk about you for a second, Bill, because you had a unique relationship with Fred Rogers, and anyone who saw the movie can see that. People that haven't seen the movie, though, let's give them a little background. What was your background prior to joining Family Communications and the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood?
I taught elementary school. I ran a child development program in the Mon Valley. I worked in the Pennsylvania Department of Education for many years in early childhood education, and then was the executive assistant to the Secretary Bob Wilburn in the Thornburg administration. And I had no intentions of leaving Harrisburg. It was not something I wanted to do. So when I was first asked by Fred, I actually said no, I was not interested in coming back. It was not actually Fred who asked me, but somebody from the company had called. I said I was not interested in coming back to Pittsburgh. I was born and raised here. Had a 5-year-old son. My wife was, happy. Everything was good. But I then Fred was in Harrisburg for an event for the governor, and Bob Wilburn said to me, I can't believe Fred Rogers offered you a job and you turned it down. And I said, well, I really, he didn't offer it to me. They called and asked if I was interested. He said, well, that's not what I heard, and I think you should call him. And I did. I called Fred and I said, look, I'll, would consider the job, and came in and interviewed, and I took the job. So my background was basically in early childhood education, and I met Fred through Margaret McFarland. When I was at graduate school in the University of Pittsburgh, Margaret was a professor, and she was Fred's main consultant. So a lot of things just aligned at the right time for me. Being in the right place at the right time, having met Fred prior to going to Harrisburg when I was in graduate school, staying in contact with him. But it was a unique opportunity to be asked to come and work with him.
One of the things that I know from talking to people who've worked with Fred Rogers, and you do kind of see it in the movie, but he does have this charisma, this charm. And what were the factors when you decided to go work for him? What was it that made you decide, I'm going to take this path instead of the path that I'm on?
Well, when I think about it, and I think about talking to my boss at the time, who was Bob Wilburn, it was, you're not going to get another chance to work with Fred Rogers. And again, it was the early 80s. So, Fred was not, the program was very popular, but he was not as well known as America as he was in 10 years later, or even today. So it was an opportunity when I met him, and the genuineness, how much he cared about giving children the best that he could. Having worked with young children, knowing the importance of early childhood education, I just thought this is an opportunity I can't pass up.
Do you remember the first meeting, the first time you met Fred Rogers?
I really do. Margaret McFarland, who I mentioned, who was Fred's consultant and a professor of mine, she said to me one day after class, she asked to see me, and she said, there's not many men in early childhood, But a friend of mine is premiering a new series that he's done on healthcare and children. And I'd like you to come and visit him. His name is Fred Rogers. Well, I had heard about Fred and heard about the neighborhood. So I met Margaret at WQED on a Friday evening, and I met Fred for the first time. And he was sitting there, and she took me up. She said, Fred, I want you to meet a student of mine, Bill Eisler. And Fred said, you're very lucky to have Margaret as a teacher. I mean, it was a typical Fred comment. It wasn't, it's great to meet you. It's you have an opportunity here, and I hope you're taking advantage of it. And I couldn't believe that somebody would right away put the focus on somebody else and not on himself, because my next thing was, it's really a pleasure to meet you. I think the work you do is amazing. And he answered, I'm glad you like our work. That was something he would always say to people, is I'm glad you can appreciate what we do. Fred never used a personal pronoun. It was always a group effort. It was we, it was us, it was our. And we talked about class. He wanted to know what I thought about Margaret as a teacher. And again, in Fred's style, he wanted to know as much about you as he could. You very rarely got a question in, because the questions were coming from him. He was very interested in everybody.
What did he do with the information when he asked questions? We can speculate, but what did he typically do?
Tim, that is a great question, and it's one that I wished everybody would ask, because usually what I would say, and I will tell you what I say, Fred would use that information somewhere in a script, in a story, or in a book. I met someone who. Everything he did was based on his real-life experiences. I mean, all the puppets were named after people that he knew. They took on characteristics of people he knew. So Fred included everything he saw and observed in his work. And he was a phenomenal observer of children and families and people in general. And he would use that all the time when he was writing his scripts or writing his stories or writing his speeches.
Well, let's go back. You met Fred when you were younger, and then you eventually went to work with him. So now you're working with him, and there's something that you know about people. Every leader has a blind spot. Every leader has something that they're really good at, and they know their strengths and they know their weaknesses, and that's why they bring certain people into their teams to complement them. What did you do for him that maybe he couldn't do for himself or didn't need to do for himself?
I could say no. He could not say no. He had a very difficult time saying no to people. And so I would be he would say, well, I think you should talk to Bill. And I would explain what his schedule was like, what his life was like, what his work was like. So I think that I think one of the things I could do was to help him say no. The other thing is to really help him in meeting people, because he really did like to meet people. And I can remember many times we would be somewhere and I would say to him, I think we should give so-and-so a call. Let's go see them. As an example, we were in Princeton, New Jersey, and Ernie Boyer, who was a really, really well-known higher ed authority, I mean, really an educator beyond educator, but really in teacher education, had written a book called Ready to Learn. And PBS was picking up that title and the concept behind a book for their Ready to Learn project. And I said to Fred, why don't we call him? And we went over to see him. And it was, Ernie Boyer couldn't believe he was meeting with Fred Rogers, and Fred couldn't believe he was meeting with Ernie Boyer. But Fred was, he was reluctant to really take away from people their time, because he knew what it was like, how limited time was when you're trying to work all the time. But that began a relationship, and they both were the co-honorary chairs for the PBS Ready to Learn project. But I can remember a lot of times that I would call people and say, let's just meet them. And he always enjoyed meeting people and talking with new people, because, again, going back to what he would learn from them.
It's almost a form of original research for him.
Exactly.
Now, when you said no, did Fred Rogers typically agree with that, or were there times when you said no when he wished you hadn't?
Well, I did in the movie It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. I I advised against him meeting with Tom Junot because I considered it a fluff piece. I mean, it was going to be a sidebar for a much larger article. And Tom Junot had just written a pretty scathing article. And he was really a tough investigative reporter. It wasn't that I was worried about Fred. I never worried about that because he could handle himself. I mean, for what reason? My argument would be, why would we do this? It's a puff piece. Fred said, I still think we should do it. And a relationship ended or began that didn't end until Fred died. I mean, those two remained in communication throughout Fred's life.
Well, that actually brings me to the question of Fred Rogers and his management style, because we've talked about how he was as a public figure, as a leader. What was his management style like with the rest of the people on the team?
Fred really appreciated a team of individuals around him who would be honest with him and who would be willing to share what they thought was important to children and what would work in the neighborhood. Both prior to and going into the studio, he liked working with groups. I mean, he appreciated that. Even though he wrote everything by himself in a writing room, which was, he didn't want to be interrupted. That kind of work was done by himself. He really liked people around him, and he liked people who would offer him suggestions and to some degree criticism. He knew what he wanted. That was one of the things. And we knew it was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. We knew that he was the person that was responsible for everything. But he had incredible instincts. He had a very, very good business instinct when we were working on book projects or licensing projects. Fred was involved in everything, and he really did understand the business side of it, although he would not usually talk about it. He understood what had to be done. So his style was, we are going to do what we do the best we can do it.
Well, that's his management style. There was an attraction to Fred's profession. It was actually a vocation. 1962, apparently, he earned this divinity degree, and he was ordained by the Presbyterian Church. And it was said in an article that I read that the church asked him to serve children and families through television. Is that true?
Yes, children and television through the media, because television at that time was still pretty new, but it was all media. And that was actually in the charge whenever he was ordained by Bill Barker, who was a Presbyterian minister, who was the voice of Dr. Bill Platypus and Elsie Jean, Dr. Bill Platypus on the neighborhood. So it just goes to show you that Fred relationships in the seminary carried through into his work in the neighborhood. And he and Bill Barker were friends. Bill preached his memorial service.
One thing you didn't hear from Fred much was an overt reference to religion when he, not only in his show, but even in a lot of his public appearances. How did he fit his religious faith into what he did for a living, and how did he keep them separate?
Well, Fred felt, his religious beliefs were his beliefs. And he felt that there were children who had, of all the children that he was, meeting with through the neighborhood, they had many religions and no religions, and he did not want to single one out. So he became very non-denominational and very ecumenical. And Fred studied the Old Testament in Greek and Hebrew. He really was a theological scholar. And he took his faith very seriously, but it was very personal. The way he lived and the way he's portrayed in the movie is actually the way he lived.
So when we talk about his faith, what episodes do you remember were more iconic for him when it came to the issue of faith?
Boy, that's a really, really hard question, because it's a judgmental question. I think it would people would answer it differently based upon their own faith and belief. But I would say the Jeff Erlinger piece, where the little boy in the wheelchair, the fact that he overcame so many issues and still remained a positive human being was something that Fred really believed. And it's in the movie, it's a line in the movie, and it's a line Fred would say, that he believed that people who were going through massive personal struggles, whether they were emotional or physical, with the strength they had to be closer to God. And that was Fred's faith, and he really believed that. But I would say in terms of episodes, certainly the Jeff Erlinger piece, but I would also say that there was a piece of Fred's belief in the basic goodness of every human being in every single neighborhood. It was almost a Quaker type of belief that Fred had, that everybody has something of goodness in them.
You know, you talk about that episode, and I think that was listed as one of his favorite episodes of all time.
Right, exactly.
There were other iconic episodes. There were the episodes involving Itzhak Perlman, and there were some other people that he highlighted. But there were also those everyday moments. And in fact, my kids, when I talked to them about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood when they were growing up, they remember the times he would take his young neighbors out into the factories and see how things are being made. What do you hear from people as far as the most memorable aspects of the program?
Yeah, Tim, let me tell you how, again, the way you and I would describe those, and your children would describe those episodes in the way Fred described them. When people would say, I love when you go to the factories, I love how you see how things are made, Fred would always say, I'm glad you can appreciate seeing how people make things. And again, he would bring that back to the individuals. If you didn't have the people in those factories, you wouldn't have a product. So people were central to everything. Relationships are what mattered. They matter to a 3-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 60-year-old. It's all about the relationships we have, how we form them and how we keep them, and how important they are to our own growth. That's why when Fred would use the moment of silence, he would always end the same way. You know, I'm glad you could take the time to think about the people who have made you who you are today. Think how they would feel knowing you're thinking about them. It was Fred. That was Fred's philosophy. That was his theology. It's what he firmly believed and lived every single day of his life.
It's funny you say that, because we talk about how things are being made, but as you're saying, it was always about the relationship. So now when you go back to those video clips, you will see that he will talk to the production line worker and ask them how they like their work.
Exactly. I remember he was in Grand Central Station. He was doing a segment with Maya Lin, the architect who did the Vietnam Memorial. And she had done a clock, and a policeman was there to just maintain order. And Fred went over to him and just started to talk to him. And he pulled his hat off, and in his cap, in his policeman's hat, he had pictures of his young children. And he said, this is what I think about every day. This is why they're so close to me. And Fred would tell that story. It was the people. And when he would leave New York, he would talk about that policeman. That's how that policeman thinks about his children. Isn't that amazing? That always resonated with Fred, and he relished the interactions and how people would tell them stories about their own lives.
You also mentioned a minute ago about that moment of silence, and that brought to mind the time he won that one award. I think it was an Emmy. And he stood up on the podium in front of all these Hollywood stars, and he called for a moment of silence.
Oh, it's a beautiful night in this neighborhood. So many people have helped me to come to this night. Some of you are here, some are far away, some are even in heaven. All of us have special ones who have loved us into being. Would you just take, along with me, 10 seconds to think of the people who have helped you become who you are? Those who have cared about you and wanted what was best for you in life. 10 seconds of silence. I'll watch the time.
Could you describe that moment?
Yeah, there are two of those. There are two of those, and I can deal with both of them if you want me to, but because I was lucky to be at both. The first is when he won his Lifetime Achievement Award, and it was at Radio City Music Hall. And we walked in for the rehearsal, and he had asked for a moment of silence. And we walked in, and it was a Dick Clark production, and Dick Clark was standing there. And he said, I'm really honored to meet you, but we can't give you a minute of silence. And Fred said, well, can you give me 15 seconds? Just people meeting Fred, knowing how genuine he was when he was backstage. He met Susan Lucci. She was one of the running the program, and she said, I can't believe you know me. And he said, well, my son watches all my children all the time. I mean, people were just shocked that he would know them, but then they would get into conversations with him about their own lives. The second time is when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and that was a night that Jeff Erlinger came out and introduced him. And that evening, it was Mary Tyler Moore, it was Carl Reiner, and it was Lorne Michaels and McNeil Lair. So there were 5 people who were inducted. And the emotionality of that night, because of his 15 seconds and talking about making goodness attractive, it's something that Steve Martin, when he was introducing, Lorne Michaels, mentioned. We have to remember that part of our responsibility, as Mr. Rogers said, is to make goodness attractive. So those moments of silence really did provoke a lot of thought from a lot of people, and people remember them to this day.
Well, let's go back to the movie, because we're kind of intertwined here between Mr. Rogers, the person, Mr. Rogers, the neighborhood, and now the movie, It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. I read something that really sounded so characteristic of what I've learned about Mr. Rogers, and that is the producers approached you in 2013 to discuss the film. They said that you or somebody told them that there will never, ever be a Fred Rogers movie. Was that you, and what was your thinking behind that?
It was me, and it was very personal. Fred really never wanted his life out there. I mean, he wanted his work to stand for itself. It was not about Fred. It was about the work. It was not about the person. Originally, when he named a company Family Communications, it wasn't about Fred Rogers or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It was about the work, the importance of the work, and he wanted it to stand for itself. And they had presented a script that we did not like and we would not agree to. So they really pressed us hard and said, look, would you just be willing to talk with the 2 young writers, Micah and Noah? And they came to Pittsburgh, and they spent 2 days at the Fred Rogers Archives at the Fred Rogers Center in Latrobe, PA, at St. Vincent College, and they came back with wanting to do it more than ever because of what they had read. So they had, read the Tom Janot's story in Esquire, and they talked to Tom, and it was a story more about the relationship between Fred and Tom than it was about Fred. It wasn't a biop in the end. It was a story about a relationship between 2 individuals who were really helping each other.
I saw something that described the movie as the entire movie is a Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood episode for adults.
It's a great way to put it, Tim. It is a great way to put it. And I think that the writers, and I can't say enough about Maury Heller. I mean, the director was brilliant. But Peter Seraf, who is really responsible for putting this all together and was one of the producers, and it was his company, Big Beach, who came to us, they really understood what Fred's life and work was about. And again, they kept saying, it's not a biop. It's not a biop. You're not going to go and see Fred Rogers' life story. That Morgan Neville dealt with in the documentary and did a beautiful job. This was really based on how Fred lived his life and interacted with people.
I think based on what you just described, I can see why you went along and agreed to do it. But there was another person involved, and they talked to Joanne Rogers, and they got to know her, and they got to know her wishes. And one of the things that she said to them when it finally came down to it, you agreed to do it, she agreed to do it, but she told the producers, the only thing that's important to me is that you don't make him into a saint. Because if you make him into a saint, what he does seems unattainable. And I want you to know that he worked at it every single day. So what was it about Joanne Rogers, and were the same dynamics at play with her that prompted her to go along with this?
Yeah, Joanne and Fred had a very amazing marriage and relationship. They were very close friends. They had met when they were in college. They raised 2 sons. Joanne was with Fred all the time. But Joanne had her own professional life. She was a concert pianist. I mean, she had a 2-piano partner. And yet they complemented each other beautifully. Joanne understood how hard Fred worked, from the Children's Corner, which was his first program on WQED, to Canada when he came out for the first time to be on camera, and when he came back to Pittsburgh and the neighborhood, and all the ups and downs of that, getting that program on. And what she wanted was authenticity, and she felt that they gave her authenticity. And she was available to them. She spoke with them. She felt, again, as I felt, that they were delivering a realistic script about Fred and Fred's life and Fred's work. Now, she also knew Tom Janot and had maintained contact with Tom and his family. So she was very comfortable with that original story of, can you say hero?
Right.
And of Tom's writing and of Tom's work.
So she felt that it was in good hands between
Very
the producers
yes.
and Tom and everybody involved.
Yeah, I mentioned Peter Saraf. I mean, Peter came to Pittsburgh on many occasions to meet with us. We got to see a rough cut of the film, not from a critical point of view, but from is it accurate? Right? Are the facts accurate? It was a working relationship that was just perfect. And again, Tom Hanks coming to Pittsburgh. I remember the first time we met with him, and he is bigger than life. When he hits the room, he's there. And his, the first thing he wanted to know, did he talk as slowly as he talked? And Joanne said, again, what you see is what you get. Also he said, and he's talked about this in his interviews, when he asked, did Fred know me? And I said, look, he saw Forrest Gump probably 40 times. And he thought that the movie Big, that you were so in touch with your inner child that he asked everybody to see it. And the other film that he was really moved by, and your acting was Philadelphia. So Fred knew the Hanks work, the body of work.
And he trusted that.
Oh, trusted it totally. And again, we trusted the writers, we trusted the producers, and Mari could not have done a better job of delivering a really beautiful, beautiful, beautiful portrayal of Fred.
That's all part of pop culture. There were other references to Fred Rogers over the years in pop culture, some of it satirical, some of it in respectful humor, some of it not always respectful. How did he react to his portrayal in these other mediums?
We had a conversation one time about this. It was pretty heavy about the takeoffs on him. And Fred said, as long as they're not mean. And, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood with Eddie Murphy, and he had met Eddie Murphy, they were not mean. And so it was meanness that got to Fred. But he also said that the first time he did The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, when there was a commercial break, he said, Mr. Carson leaned over to me and said, I hope you don't mind when we do parodies about you, because that's the highest compliment somebody can pay somebody who's in this business. And it's meant as affection and appreciation for the work you do. And Fred said that really helped him. So if it was mean humor, Fred was opposed to it. If it was funny, if it was, as Eddie Murphy did, he accepted that.
There was also one other instance, and it's sort of disjointed from this, but it's in Washington. And I remember years ago, I was doing some work myself with QED, and it was an anniversary. So we were rounding things up, and they brought this moment up, and they used the video. And now you've seen it in documentaries, but it's that time he gave that statement
for Congress.
Could I tell you the words of one of the songs which I feel is very important?
Yes.
This has to do with that good feeling of control, which I feel that children need to know is there. And it starts out, what do you do with the mad that you feel? And that first line came straight from a child. I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups. What do you do with the mad that you feel when you feel so mad you could bite? When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong and nothing you do seems very right. What do you do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, stop, stop anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this and know that the feeling is really mine. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can. For a girl can be someday a lady, and a boy can be someday a man.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
Now, it's very interesting. He was in his late 40s. Fred was not always comfortable in big crowds. I mean, you could see you can see every time I see that video, I see something different, but you can see him rubbing his hands. I mean, he was nervous. And again, the senator said, in his opening remarks for the day when Fred was just in the audience, I'm just sick and tired of people coming and reading things. It's been just 2 days of everybody reading. And the exchange and the change in the attitude. But Fred and the senator stayed in written communication after that.
Did Fred Rogers leave a legacy in Washington after that? Because I know that had a lot to do with funding for PBS. Did that legacy continue after that?
No, I think so. I think PBS has stood for quality programming for children. That's been their legacy. The Neighborhood was on a year before Sesame Street, but I can remember Joan Gans Cooney being asked a question one time. She was the founder of Sesame Street. She was the woman who originated it. They said about in the mid 70s, early 80s about a lot of really not appropriate material on television for kids, and she said, "Give me an hour and a half, and I'll show you 2 great programs on PBS." And you can trust PBS to provide quality for children. And to this day, they have set the standard for quality programming. And I think they would say to you that it is the legacy of Mr. Rogers, of Fred Rogers, of that type of quality of programming. And the company today has 3 programs on PBS, and they just have a 4th one picked up. So PBS appreciates the early work of Fred Rogers and him setting the bar at a very, very high level for quality children's programming.
Well, it seems to me that was your primary job, that once Fred stepped back from producing new shows, and then after Fred died, you continued on pretty much running the Fred Rogers Company. What would you consider your number one mission in that role?
Well, it was really to continue when you talk about the mission, it was to continue the mission and the legacy of Fred Rogers, and you use both of those words, that Fred had established a program that children liked and children wanted to see, and adults might not have understood it. I cannot tell you the number of people who would say to me, I never got it until I had a child, and I would see how my child would see it. And I want to tell you a story about Matthew Rhys, who played the Janot character in the movie. I saw him after the film, and he said to me, my son, he's a 3-year-old, and he's pretty wild. He said, I decided one day, because I grew up in Wales and I never saw The Neighborhood, I would just watch The Neighborhood. And I couldn't believe that I'm watching this black and white neighborhood because I wanted to go back to the early days. And my son said to me, Daddy, that man's talking directly to me. He said, I just decided I was going to start downloading other programs for him. The magic is with the child. It appeals to the child. That is what we wanted to preserve, that if we were going to continue to do programming for children, we wanted to do it in the same high quality that Fred stood for. Make it for the child, not for the adult. So the first program we did was Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and Angela Santamera, who had been inspired by Fred whenever she did Blue's Clues, had met Fred on a couple of occasions. And the person at PBS who was assigned to work with us on that was Paul Siefken. And we, asked Paul and convinced him to, move his family to Pittsburgh and take over the company. And he is somebody who worked at the Cartoon Network and he worked at PBS. And Paul's life is to provide the best he can to children, the same as Fred's. So we've been fortunate to find people who share our values, who share Fred's values and Fred's concerns of providing quality programming for children. And the company's still doing it to this day, and will.
In the course of your daily routine, when you're totally out in the world and not thinking about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, have you ever had a time where you actually saw the impact, the direct cause and effect impact of Fred Rogers on the world?
That's a question I could spend about an hour with you talking about. That's not an easy, simple one to answer, and I have to answer that in many different ways. People today will say, are you surprised about the resurgence of interest in Fred Rogers and his work? And my comeback is, I don't think there's been a resurgence. I think it's always been there. People want, it's what Fred says, people want to believe that they are lovable and that they can love. People want to believe that there are people out there doing good things for people. And I think when I see people, and you think about 3 generations, 4 generations who know about the neighborhood, that and there are a lot of, I said this in the documentary, there are a lot of Fred Rogers out there. They're not with a talent that can write music and do puppets and write books, but they do believe that there is goodness in this world and there is goodness in people, and they want to make goodness attractive. So, yeah, there are a lot of times I will reflect on what Fred stood for and what Fred believed and what Fred worked for, that there are a lot of other people out there who are doing very, very similar things. And if I may say, because we're sitting in Squirrel Hill, a little over a year ago when a massacre hit at Tree of Life, think about all the people that rose to the occasion. And that is significant because it helped a heck of a lot of people get through a very, very difficult time. That were the relationships that I talked about. Those relationships weren't made just that day. They were there. And people coming out to help other people. To me, it is significant that what Fred believed in, the majority of people believe in.
Well, you brought up the Squirrel Hill and the incident there. And I remember on 9/11, Fred Rogers made a special episode after 9/11. Would that have been his final episode?
That's when he did the public service announcements.
Oh, that was it. Okay.
And that they were very, very difficult for him to do because, he was saying there are adults there who will help you and trying to justify both sides of it. But he did it, and he did it in a beautiful style, and they're the final PSAs that he did. Yeah.
And the quote from those was, look for the helpers.
Always look for the helpers.
And every time you see a major disaster or a major tragedy, if you're on social media, you'll see people create these memes, and they'll bring Mr. Rogers' words back.
Right
and
back.
You do see his influence every day in these other contexts.
Yep, every day. You're right. I mean, it's there. And that's why I say I think that there are a lot of people out there. There are more people than we give credit to who are really doing magnificent things for people.
Bill Eisler, thank you for joining us today.
Tim, thank you. It was really a great conversation. I really appreciate you asking me to do this. It was really enjoyable to catch up. I mean, we met each other many, many years ago, and it's been a long time, but thank you very much.
To learn more about Bill Eisler and everything we talked about today, see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please help others find it. Leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.